They vanished, and no one questioned it. Not a sound, not a trace. But why her? Something had happened, something no one dared speak of. They told her it wasn't her job. Yet she had no choice. Orders came in whispers, with eyes that didn't blink. Do this, or something worse would follow. But what, no one would say. And still she obeyed. The silence pressed down like a weight, thick and suffocating. Every corner of the camp seemed to watch her. Shadows lingered longer than they should, as if they had memories of their own. She paused at the doorway. Should she step inside? Could she refuse? The question burned in her chest, but there was no answer. No one spoke, no one moved, the world held its breath. Her hands shook, though she told herself it was only fatigue. But the tremor wasn't just in her hands. It was in her thoughts, in the quickening beat of her heart, in the way her mind clung to fragments of sound and light. The whispers of the guards, the soft scrape of boots on stone, the faint moan from the distant ward, they all seemed amplified, all carrying a meaning she could not grasp. Every step she took felt heavier, as if invisible chains had wrapped around her ankles. She tried to focus on the routine, on the tasks in front of her, but the tasks seemed meaningless now. Each action carried a shadow she couldn't shake. She questioned herself. Was this obedience or complicity? Was she helping or simply watching as something dark unfolded? Hours stretched into an eternity. Moments repeated, almost like echoes trapped in a canyon. She could not distinguish the beginning from the end. Every detail, an empty bed, a closed door, a silent glance, took on significance that she couldn't define. Her mind wandered through possibilities. What would happen if she refused? And yet, what if she obeyed? Either choice felt wrong, yet inevitable. Fear and duty tangled inside her, knotting tighter with each passing second. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to cry out, but silence had become the only safe language. And so she moved forward step by step, through a world that seemed to hold its breath and judged her with its quiet. Something in the camp had shifted. The routines, once rigid and predictable, wavered at the edges. Breakfast arrived late. The guards lingered in corners, their glances darting toward the walls, the windows, the silent faces of the prisoners. No one acknowledged it, yet everyone felt it. The doctor noticed the anomalies immediately. A tray left on the floor, slightly askew, a boot print where it shouldn't be, a whisper of movement in a hallway that should have been empty. She paused, unsure whether to act, to speak, to question, but she did nothing. Silence had become the language of survival. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Moments that should have been brief lingered endlessly. The ticking of the clock was sharper than it had ever been, each second amplified, each pause between tick and tock growing heavier, more oppressive. Even breathing felt loud in the quiet. And then came the small details, things that might have seemed insignificant if noticed in isolation, but when combined, formed a pattern too disturbing to ignore. The bed in room 7, once neatly made, appeared disheveled. A note that had been pinned to the notice board yesterday had vanished without a trace. A chair in the common room had shifted, though no one was there. The doctor's chest tightened with each discovery, but she said nothing. Her internal struggle became sharper. Obedience demanded action, yet fear demanded stillness. Each moment of hesitation stretched into eternity. Every heartbeat was a question. What had changed? And what would follow? The strange events began to accumulate. Not all at once, but slowly, almost imperceptibly. The camp seemed to breathe differently, as though it had taken on a life of its own. Doors that were closed yesterday were now open. Windows caught light at odd angles, casting long shadows that flickered across walls. Sounds appeared where there should have been none. The scrape of a chair, a whisper too soft to understand, a distant footstep that left no trace. The doctor felt her senses sharpen unnaturally. Every detail was magnified. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a sound that might have been wind or might have been something else entirely. She could not tell. Each anomaly fed the tension inside her. Every small irregularity demanded attention, yet no explanation came. Fear became an invisible presence, a constant companion. It whispered questions she could not answer. Why is this happening? Who is responsible? And what will happen next? The uncertainty gnawed at her mind. She found herself replaying every detail, trying to connect the dots, yet each new observation only deepened the confusion. Isolation intensified the effect. Though surrounded by people, she felt utterly alone. The prisoners moved in silence, the guards watched without expression, and the camp itself seemed to hold its breath. Every glance, every step, every sound was charged with unspoken meaning, but the meaning was elusive. And then came the repeated details, the small echoes that refused to be ignored. A shadow lingered at the edge of vision, a cough in the distance, too deliberate to be accidental, a footstep that never passed her door. Each repetition tightened the coil of tension inside her. She began to feel trapped not by walls, but by the invisible weight of anticipation, as though the camp itself had become a cage woven of silence and suspicion. The repetition became maddening. Each detail that refused resolution created another layer of unease. She noticed the same nurse pausing mid-step, staring at the ceiling, then moving on as though nothing had occurred. The same guard lingered near the stairwell, glancing back repeatedly, though there was nothing to see. These small, unexplained actions layered upon each other, forming a web of uncertainty and dread. Her mind clung to every sound, every fleeting glance, every anomaly. The ordinary became sinister. A tray rattling on a table was no longer a simple accident. It was a signal, a warning, a secret too dangerous to name. The quiet murmur of the patients' voices became a chant she could not decipher. Each repetition of the smallest event became magnified, etched into her consciousness, impossible to ignore. And yet, despite the mounting tension, nothing was ever revealed. There were no confrontations, no answers, no clarifications. Each new discovery raised further questions, each anomaly a lock on the growing psychological cage. The tension became almost tactile, pressing against her chest, constricting her movements, controlling the rhythm of her heartbeat. The doctor's internal struggle reached its peak. Every decision, whether to act or to remain silent, felt impossible. The weight of the unknown was crushing, yet she continued forward, compelled by duty, fear, and a strange, unspoken need to witness what unfolded. She became acutely aware of every detail, every nuance, every echo of sound and shadow. Each one deepened her unease, yet she could not turn away. By the end of this phase, the camp had become a place where time, space, and action lost their usual meaning. Every routine, every step, every glance had taken on a significance she could neither define nor escape. The tension was complete. The audience, carried along with her, felt every moment of dread, every heartbeat of suspense, every unspoken question. And still, the ultimate truth remained just out of reach. The events did not unfold immediately. The consequences did not strike like lightning or a sudden storm. They crept in, subtle and insidious, like shadows stretching across walls at dusk. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The hallways were quiet, the patients silent. But a careful observer would notice the small things: beds left empty, a tray gone untouched, footsteps that seemed out of sync with the usual rhythm of the camp. The doctor noticed them, of course. She could not ignore the anomalies. Each missing record, each vanishing item, felt deliberate. She could almost sense the invisible hand erasing traces of what had happened. And the people, they changed too, in ways that were difficult to describe. Those who had witnessed events, even in part, became ghosts of themselves. Eyes darted nervously. Hands trembled. Conversations stopped abruptly when she entered the room. A whispered question died in the throat of the one who asked it. The survivors avoided speaking of what had occurred, not out of forgetfulness, but out of fear, or perhaps loyalty to a silence older than the camp itself. The doctor felt it too. The air had changed. The walls seemed to hold a memory of something forbidden. Every step she took, every hand she extended in care, was weighed down by an invisible presence, a lingering reminder of what had been lost and deliberately concealed. She could not tell whether it was guilt, fear, or something darker entirely that pressed against her chest. Files disappeared, logs were erased, notes vanished from blackboards as though they had never existed. The hospital seemed to have been rewritten overnight, yet she knew it had not been so simple. The erasure was selective, precise, and unnervingly complete. It was as if someone or something had decided that certain knowledge could not survive. And yet there were signs that lingered, faint and haunting. A shadow across a door, a fleeting whisper that carried no words, the faint creak of floorboards in empty rooms. These remnants were enough to unsettle the mind, to remind the observer that what had not been forgotten entirely. She walked the halls, her steps echoing in the silence. The patients stared without seeing, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Guards passed without acknowledgement. The ordinary routines continued, yet everything had changed. The erasure had been thorough but not perfect. Fragments remained like shards of glass embedded in the memory of the camp. She questioned herself constantly. Had she imagined the events? Were they a shared hallucination of fear and stress? Or had something truly unnameable occurred, something so deliberate that even its existence was being denied? Each unanswered question wrapped tighter around her mind, constricting her thoughts. And the silence was its own punishment. It weighed more heavily than any words could. Where there should have been explanation, there was only absence. Where there should have been records, there was only blank paper. Where there should have been memory, there was only denial. The hospital itself had been altered by these events. It was no longer a place of healing, of care, or of routine. It had become a vessel of quiet terror, a repository for acts unrecorded and memories unspoken. Even those who remained physically unharmed carried scars invisible to the eye, etched deep into the psyche. The doctor moved through it all, aware of the unseen forces shaping her environment. Every corner, every corridor, every silent room carried a weight she could not define. The absence of explanation made the tension unbearable. She could feel the erasure around her, a deliberate cleansing of fact and witness, and yet the residues lingered, faint but undeniable. The survivors, those few who remained, avoided her gaze. They spoke only when necessary, and even then their voices trembled. It was not fear of punishment alone that silenced them, but the understanding that some events were beyond discussion, beyond comprehension. Something had happened that could not be named, and the very act of naming it might make it real again. In these 6 years, or whatever amount of time it might have been, she became aware that what had occurred would never be documented, would never be understood. It existed only in fragments, in fleeting impressions, in the lingering weight of absence. And that absence, more than any act of cruelty, more than any order or punishment, became the most powerful force in the camp. The erasure was thorough yet incomplete, and that incompleteness was what haunted her. The shadows of the vanished, the echoes of lost events, the memory of what had been erased, all of it pressed against her consciousness. She could not forget, and yet she could not speak. The tension of what had occurred, combined with the deliberate silence and erasure, transformed the camp. It became a place that existed outside the normal flow of time, a world apart, a microcosm where memory itself was fragile and unreliable. Every footstep, every glance, every sound carried with it the weight of the unspoken, the erased, the deliberately hidden. And so she walked through it, step by step, hour by hour, bearing witness to events that had been carefully expunged, forced to inhabit a reality where what happened could not be acknowledged, recorded, or understood. The silence itself was an entity. It watched, it waited, it preserved the erasure. And in that silence she understood that some consequences cannot be documented, some horrors cannot be named. They exist only in the minds of those who survived, lingering like a shadow that refuses to fade. The hospital would never be the same. The survivors would never be the same. And she would never be the same. Because when history itself chooses to forget, the ones left behind bear the full weight of what has been erased. The consequences were not immediate, not dramatic, not cinematic. They were quiet, subtle, persistent, and they endured long after the events themselves had been wiped from the record, long after the world outside had moved on. The silence became a living thing, feeding on memory, shaping reality, and forcing every observer to confront what cannot be acknowledged. And in that silence, she felt the full scope of human complicity, human fear, and human vulnerability. And the truth, if it could ever be spoken, would shatter what remained of her world. They never explained what happened. No one ever spoke. And yet it lingered. The camp itself seemed suspended in a quiet that was heavier than any noise. Hallways stretched longer than memory should allow, shadows deepened, and the air carried a subtle weight, like the residue of something unspoken pressing down on every surface. The walls remembered. They remembered the footsteps, the whispered commands, the unrecorded moments of terror, and they remembered her. She walked through the corridors slowly, deliberately, aware of every echo. Every sound became amplified, a distant cough, a door creaking, the faint rustle of cloth. Each was a reminder that something had occurred here, something vast, irreversible, and erased from every official account. She had no witness but herself. The silence of others was not ignorance. It was deliberate, complicity wrapped in quiet. The patients avoided her gaze. Their eyes carried questions they would not voice. They moved as if the events themselves had carved invisible chains around them, chains stronger than any bars or locks. They were free to walk, to breathe, to exist, but only within the confines of this imposed silence. The doctor realized that the weight of what had happened was not merely in the actions taken, but in the absence of acknowledgement. That absence was its own consequence, more lasting than any punishment could have been. She tried to piece it together mentally from fragments and impressions. Each clue, each anomaly she had observed in earlier days, now pressed on her mind with renewed urgency. The small details, the displaced chairs, the empty trays, the vanished files, formed a lattice of understanding that was terrifying in its completeness, and yet incomplete, impossible to fully name or prove. Time no longer flowed in a straightforward manner. Moments from the past seemed to seep into the present. She would see a figure out of the corner of her eye, someone she knew had been gone for days, weeks, or even years. She would hear a sound that belonged to an event already erased. The boundaries between memory and reality blurred, and with them, the certainty of her own senses. And then came the question that refused to leave her mind. What does it mean to survive when the truth has been deliberately erased? Survival was no longer a measure of body or health, but of memory. To exist in a world where nothing was recorded, where nothing was acknowledged, was to bear the weight of knowledge that no one else could share. And that burden was heavier than chains, heavier than fear, heavier than anything she had known before. She understood that the silence surrounding her was not empty. It was active. It was deliberate. It consumed, preserved, and dictated. It shaped reality as effectively as any order given or action taken. In that silence, she felt the presence of human nature at its most raw: fear, obedience, complicity, and the strange, fragile courage of those who witness but do not act. As she walked, she realized that some events are not meant to be explained. Some truths are too dangerous, too vast, too morally complex to be recorded. The world outside may never know, may never understand, and that was intentional. The erasure was complete. The consequences were absolute. The silence was eternal. And yet there were moments of clarity. In quiet reflection, she could feel the lingering imprint of what had occurred, the weight of moral choice, the presence of fear, the echo of unspoken orders. She could sense the fragility of humanity, its capacity for both cruelty and endurance. These insights were impossible to convey, impossible to share, but they were hers, undeniable, indelible. The camp would never be the same. The survivors would never be the same. And she would never be the same. Because some events do not conclude neatly. Some acts do not result in punishment or justice. Some truths exist only in the tension between silence and memory. And in that tension, she understood a chilling fact. History is not only what is recorded, but also what is deliberately erased. She paused in the center of the main hall, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath with her, and then the silence resumed its reign, heavier than before, patient, omnipresent. It did not end. It did not forgive. It did not allow understanding. It merely existed as it always had and as it always would. She turned, knowing she must leave. Yet the imprint of what had happened remained, not in the walls, not in the absent records, not in the erased moments, but within herself. The knowledge that some events are permanent, even when forgotten, became a quiet, unyielding companion. And the final question hovered, unanswered, unresolved, yet impossible to ignore. What are we willing to endure when silence becomes the only witness?